The sun dipped low over the vast Arizona plains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, while the wind whispered through the tall prairie grasses as if carrying secrets of the land itself. In the small, weathered town of Redstone, life moved slowly, marked by the distant clatter of wagon wheels and the soft hum of a blacksmith's hammer. The townsfolk whispered stories of frontier hardships and wild nights under endless skies, but none had ever whispered a tale quite like the one that was about to unfold. Amid this harsh but beautiful land, a young woman named Leora tended a modest cabin at the edge of the settlement. Her eyes, the color of storm clouds, carried a quiet strength, a determination forged from years of surviving in a world that demanded courage from women and men alike. Leora had grown up in the shadows of rugged mountains, learning to ride before she could walk, and to fight for her life before she learned to dance at a town gathering. Yet, despite the toughness in her hands and the fire in her gaze, there was a gentleness about her, kindness, that seemed to reach beyond herself, touching anyone who crossed her path. One evening, as the sky bled into a deeper crimson, a rider appeared on the horizon, dust trailing behind him like a drifting cloud of smoke. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a solemn face marked by lines of hardship. His name was Kalen, a wandering settler with a reputation for bravery, yet the kind of quiet sorrow that only those who had lost much could carry. Kalen brought with him a secret burden, one that weighed heavier than the saddle on his horse. In his arms he cradled a small, fragile infant, swaddled in rough linen, its tiny hands curling instinctively around his fingers. Leora's heart caught in her chest the moment she saw the child. She had longed for a family of her own, though fate had not yet offered that blessing. There was an instinctive pull between her and the tiny life before her, and without hesitation she stepped forward, offering her hands in her care. That night, by the soft glow of a lantern and the crackle of a warming fire, she fed the infant with patience and tenderness, whispering gentle words she hoped the child would someday understand. The town of Redstone had its own rhythms and dangers, and every stranger brought a story or a threat. Kellen's presence alone stirred curiosity and caution among the townsfolk, yet he trusted Leora in a way he trusted no one else. As days passed, she nursed the baby back to health, learning the delicate balance between strength and softness, between protection and love. She named the child Little Eric, after a brave scout she had once admired, a name that seemed to carry hope in its sound. But the plains were never truly quiet, and the wind carried whispers from the distant canyons where the Apache had roamed for generations, guardians of their own lands, fierce and unyielding. It was there, far beyond the reach of Redstone, that destiny waited. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight painted Leora's cabin in gold, a shadow moved along the tree line. From the forest emerged a warrior, tall and proud, his presence commanding yet serene. His name was Tayon, known among his people for courage and honor, a protector of family and clan. Tayon's eyes fell on little Eric immediately, and a strange tension filled the air. Leora instinctively placed herself between the warrior and the child, unsure of his intentions. But as he spoke, his voice deep and steady, the words that fell from his lips froze her heart. He called her mother. The word was heavy with meaning, wrapped in mystery and reverence. Leora's mind raced, trying to comprehend how a warrior of the Apache, a stranger from a world she barely knew, could lay claim to such a title. Was it an accusation? A blessing? A claim of kinship she could not yet understand? Her heart pounded as she realized that little Eric's past, and perhaps even her own future, were entangled with forces she had not imagined, forces that carried both danger and destiny. The wind carried the scent of sage and cedar, and the desert seemed to hold its breath. Tayon did not approach recklessly. His eyes were steady, yet unreadable. He knelt slightly to meet the child's gaze, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. A connection older than words, older than the plains themselves. Leora felt it too, a pull that seemed to stretch across time, weaving her fate with that of the child and the warrior. Redstone's quiet streets would never seem the same again. Leora's neighbors whispered at doorways and behind curtains, sensing that something extraordinary had touched their town, something that could not be tamed by mere fences or the law of settlers. And Leora herself felt a tremor of anticipation and fear. Was this the beginning of an alliance, a confrontation, or a love story that the harsh wilderness itself had decreed. As the sun rose higher, turning the sky a pale, relentless blue, Leora held little Arik closer, while Taeon's shadow lingered at the edge of the cabin. The tension between them was thick, yet beneath it lay a fragile hope, a hope that perhaps together they could protect this child, nurture a bond, and face the storms that the frontier would surely bring. But the wind was changing, carrying the distant echo of hooves, and the scent of sage smoke from the mountains hinted at challenges and secrets waiting to be revealed. In that moment, Leora realized that life in Redstone and her own heart would never be simple again. She could feel destiny pressing close, like the weight of the desert sun at noon, relentless and inevitable. Every choice she made from this day forward would ripple across the plains, across generations, and perhaps even across cultures that had long stood apart. And yet, despite the uncertainty, she did not waver. Her courage was steady, her heart open, and a quiet fire burned within her, ready to face whatever came. Little Arik stirred in her arms, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Taeon's gaze remained fixed on the child, silent but commanding. And as the wind swept through the open doorway, carrying the scent of distant rain and distant danger, Leora knew this was only the beginning. The story of a woman who nursed a child, the mystery of a warrior who called her mother, and the hidden threads of love, family, and survival had just begun to unfold. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the first whispers of a journey that would change all their lives were already taking shape. Leora tightened her grip on Arik, her pulse racing, while Taeon's eyes remained unwavering.
Neither of them spoke.
Yet the unspoken promise hung in the air, that their fates were intertwined, and that the trials, the heartbreak, and perhaps the joy to come would be far greater than any of them had yet imagined. The plains waited, Redstone waited, and the story of a woman, a child, and an Apache warrior was about to etch itself into the history of the West. One secret, one heartbeat, one impossible choice at a time. The morning passed slowly, each minute stretching like the endless desert before Redstone. Leora stayed close to little Arik, moving through her cabin with careful steps as though even the sound of her own boots might disrupt the fragile balance of this new, uneasy household. Taeon lingered outside the doorway, his presence a shadow that seemed to belong to the landscape itself. His movements were deliberate, precise. Yet there was an unmistakable gentleness when he watched Arik, as if he were guarding something far greater than himself. Leora could not shake the questions swirling in her mind. How did Taeon know the child? Why had he called her mother? There was a weight in that word, something sacred and binding, and it unsettled her. She remembered stories her own grandmother had told, tales of warriors and settlers, of children lost and reclaimed, of bonds formed not by blood but by fate. Could this child be tied to such a story? Her fingers absently smoothed Arik's tiny hair as the questions grew louder in the quiet cabin. Taeon's voice finally broke the silence, deep and calm, carrying the cadence of the mountains from which he came. "The child carries the blood of my people," he said, his eyes never leaving Arik. Leora stiffened, unsure whether to fear or to trust him. "Not all blood is lost with the mother," he continued. "Some spirits endure, even through strangers. That is why I call you mother. You protect him. You keep him safe. That is what a mother does." The weight of his words settled over her like the evening fog, thick and impossible to ignore. Leora wanted to speak, to demand answers, yet she found no words strong enough. Instead, she studied Taeon, noticing the way his hands, calloused from years of hunting and travel, held themselves almost reverently. His long, dark hair fell over his shoulders, braided with strips of leather, and his eyes sharp. Unwavering held secrets she could not yet touch. Kalen, standing off to the side, shifted uneasily. The burden he carried had been heavy. But now it seemed that every secret he had tried to protect was being laid bare by Taeon's presence. He gave Leora a look that spoke of shared understanding and unspoken pain. "I found him abandoned on the northern trail," Kalen said quietly. "No parent, no clue. Just this little one. I thought I could keep him safe, but maybe fate had other plans." His voice faltered, betraying the fear he had carried silently for days. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of hooves, distant but deliberate, and Leora's heart tightened. The plains were never truly safe, not for settlers, and not for those who wandered into Apache territory. Every gust of wind could bring a messenger, every shadow could hide danger. She felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration, a feeling she could not name. Her hands lingered over Arik, as if her own touch could shield him from the unknown threats closing in from every side. Tyone stepped closer, but not too close, respecting the delicate boundary between trust and intrusion. "The child is more than he seems," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "He carries a legacy that some would kill to control. You must protect him, all of you. The plains are wide, but they are not empty. There are eyes in the hills, hunters in the forests, and those who follow the wind." Leora's pulse quickened. The calm she had tried to cling to felt fragile, as if the desert itself could crack beneath her feet. And yet, beneath her fear, a strange sense of purpose burned. She had survived harsh winters, long rides through empty canyons, and nights alone under the stars. She could protect Eric, she told herself. She would protect him. The afternoon sun climbed high, casting a harsh, golden light across the prairie. Leora moved quietly through her small garden, checking herbs she had grown for healing, while Kalen patched the roof and stacked firewood. But Taeon remained at the edge of the cabin, his eyes scanning the horizon as though he could see the movements of distant enemies in the shimmer of the heat waves above the plains. Every so often, he would glance at Arik, and the tension in his body would ease just slightly, revealing the man behind the warrior, a man capable of love, loyalty, and an almost unbearable tenderness. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky with streaks of amber and violet, Leora finally found her courage. "Tell me," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Tell me everything. Why does he matter to you? Why call me mother? What are you not telling me?" Taeon's gaze softened for a moment, and he gestured for her to sit beside him on a worn wooden bench outside the cabin. He spoke then of his people, of traditions and promises older than the settlement itself, and of a prophecy whispered among the Apache that spoke of a child born to cross boundaries, to bring together two worlds that had long been divided. The words painted a picture of a legacy that was both fragile and dangerous, of enemies who would see the child as a weapon, and allies who would see him as a hope. Every sentence deepened the mystery, but also drew Leora closer to Taeon. She could feel the unspoken tension building between them, connection forged in the shared responsibility of protecting Arik. The way he spoke, so careful yet full of passion for his people and his duty, stirred something deep in her. She realized that she was no longer just a caretaker. She was becoming part of a story far larger than herself, entwined with destiny, love, and danger in ways she had never imagined. Night fell, and the plains were bathed in silver moonlight. Crickets chirped, and a distant coyote howled, echoing across the canyon walls. Leora tucked Arik into a small cradle by the fire, and the child's soft breathing was the only sound that grounded her in the swirl of new revelations. Taeon remained outside, standing beneath the stars, a silhouette of strength and mystery against the vast sky. As the first stars blinked awake, a sudden rustle came from the edge of the garden. Leora froze, her hand reaching for a hidden knife, while Kalen moved toward the sound with wary steps. But Taeon, ever calm, held up a hand. The rustle passed, but the tension remained, a reminder that the world beyond Redstone was neither tame nor predictable. Leora felt the weight of the night pressing down, heavy with secrets and unseen eyes. She could not sleep, not with the child depending on her, not with Taeon's presence demanding answers she did not yet have. Somewhere deep in her heart, a spark of fear mixed with hope and knowledge that the coming days would challenge every belief, every skill, and every ounce of courage she possessed. And yet beneath the fear, a deeper feeling emerged, a quiet, unyielding determination. She would protect Eric. She would honor the trust of Taeon and Kalen. And in the process, she would discover truths about herself she had never dared to imagine. The plains were alive with whispers. The wind carried secrets from the distant canyons, and the night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Leora's heart beat in rhythm with the land itself, and in that rhythm, she felt the promise of love, danger, and destiny, all wrapped together in the fragile life of little Arik. As the moon climbed higher, casting silver light on the cabin and the surrounding prairie, the Traholiora Tahan and Kalen stood, poised on the edge of a story that would test every limit of courage, loyalty, and heart. The night held its mysteries close, refusing to reveal the paths ahead, and Leora understood that the journey had only begun. The plains stretched wide, the stars gleamed cold and distant, and the wind whispered that the trials to come would be greater than any she had yet faced. Somewhere beyond the hills, unseen eyes watched. Shadows moved across the dry grass, silent and patient. And as Leora held Arik close, feeling his small heartbeat against her chest, she realized that the true story of the child, the warrior, and the woman who would become his mother had only just begun. The night was full of secrets, and the dawn would bring challenges that none of them could yet imagine. The first light of dawn crept over the hills, casting long shadows across the cabin and stretching the prairie like a warning. Leora woke to the soft cooing of Arik, the child's small hands reaching toward the sunlight streaming through the window. She held him close for a moment longer, feeling the steady rhythm of his breath, and then glanced toward the edge of the forest where Taeon had been standing the previous night. His silhouette was gone now, but the weight of his presence lingered, a quiet tension in the air that seemed to press against her chest. Kalen appeared from behind the cabin, rubbing sleep from his eyes, but there was no usual ease in his step. He paused, scanning the horizon with the trained alertness of a man who had walked the wilderness longer than he cared to admit. The wind shifted, he said softly. Something's coming. Or maybe it's already here. Leora's heart tightened at his words, and she tightened her grip on Arik. The plains were open and unforgiving. There was nowhere to hide if danger arrived, yet she felt the stirrings of a strange courage, a fire that she could not quell. Hours passed in uneasy routine. Leora prepared simple meals and tended Arik, while Kalen repaired fences and carried water from the nearby stream. But every movement outside the cabin felt watched, every rustle of grass a potential threat. And through it all, Taeon remained a constant, silent shadow in her mind. Though she had not seen him since dawn, his words and the weight of his gaze lingered, pressing on her like a secret she could not yet speak aloud. By mid-afternoon, a rider approached from the northern trail. Dust swirled around him, catching the sunlight in a shimmering haze, and Leora's pulse quickened. She instinctively stepped toward the cabin's doorway, keeping Arik safe behind her. Kalan moved cautiously, hand on the hilt of his knife, while the rider slowed to a halt at the edge of the property. His eyes were sharp and wary, and his expression was one of purpose rather than courtesy. "I bring a warning," the rider said, his voice low and urgent. "There are those who know of the child. They will not stop until they have what they seek." Leora's chest tightened. The danger Taeon had spoken of was no longer a distant threat. It was at their doorstep. Kalen stepped forward. "Who are they?" "Settlers." "Raiders?" The rider shook his head. "Not settlers. Not men of Redstone. Men from the East, mercenaries, hunting for what is valuable and rare. The child. We carry something they cannot understand, but they know its worth." Leora's hands trembled slightly as she held Arik closer. The weight of the child in her arms was suddenly heavier, not from his small body but from the invisible burden he carried. Taeon's warning echoed in her mind. Eyes in the hills, hunters in the forests. Now it seemed those hunters were moving. That night, as the wind whispered across the prairie, Leora and Kalen sat by the fire, their faces etched with worry. Leora tried to calm herself, but the unease gnawed at her. "Why him?" she asked softly. "Why would anyone care about a child like this?" Kalen shook his head. "It's not the child. It's what he represents. Something old, something powerful. That's why Taeon called you mother. You protect him. That's what matters." Even as he spoke, Leora felt the pull of the larger story she had stepped into. She was no longer merely a woman caring for a child. She was a protector, a guardian, and perhaps something more. Her gaze drifted to the forest line, imagining Taeon watching over them, ready to step from shadow into light at a moment's notice. And in her heart, she felt an unfamiliar warmth, a pulse of emotion she could not yet name. Days passed, and tension grew thicker with each sunrise. Leora noticed the way Kellen's eyes lingered on the horizon, how he flinched at every sudden sound. He was a man of the land, a survivor, yet even he seemed aware of forces beyond understanding closing in. The townsfolk began whispering about the newcomers who had been spotted near Redstone, strangers with cold eyes and unfamiliar faces, asking questions about the child. Leora kept Eric close, walking the edge of the prairie only when necessary, her resolve hardening with each passing hour. Taeon finally returned one evening, emerging silently from the forest, with the poise of a man who belonged to the land rather than the town. He brought news that chilled Leora's blood. "They are closer than you know," he said, his eyes flicking to the horizon, "and not all of them come on horseback. Some move like shadows, unseen until it is too late." The air seemed to tighten around her as he spoke, and for the first time Leora felt the weight of fear not as a distant echo, but as a pressing reality. Despite the looming danger, life found moments of fragile beauty. Leora watched as Tyon, with patient hands, taught Arik to reach for simple things, small sticks, smooth stones, the sway of the prairie grass in the wind. Kalen, too, began to soften around the child, the hard edges of his survival instinct mixing with tender amusement. The cabin, though filled with unease, became a place of subtle warmth, a sanctuary in the midst of encroaching threats. Yet shadows could not be ignored for long. One night, Leora awoke to a faint sound outside the snap of a twig, the hush of movement in the grass. She clutched Arik to her chest and peered into the darkness. Her pulse raced. Taeon appeared silently at the doorway, eyes sharp, bow in hand. The forest was alive with sounds that seemed both natural and deliberate. "They are testing us," he whispered, his voice low. "Someone watches, waits for us to falter. We must not give them the chance." As Leora listened, she realized that the conflict surrounding Arik was more complex than she had imagined. It was not just about land or power, it was about legacy, secrets, and survival. The child was a symbol, a key, and perhaps even a promise that neither she nor Tyon fully understood. Each choice they made could shift the balance of the plains, and every shadow carried potential danger. In the quiet that followed, Leora allowed herself a rare moment to study Tyon. He moved with the grace of someone who had known loss and hardship, yet his presence was steady, protective. She felt the beginnings of a bond that neither words nor circumstance could fully explain. A connection forged not just in duty but in shared vulnerability. The air between them carried unspoken questions, quiet hopes, and the faint electric pulse of emotions neither dared to name. The next morning, a scout from Redstone rode up, breathless and urgent. "There are more coming," he warned. "A band of strangers armed, moving fast. They will reach the cabin before nightfall if you don't act." Leora's chest tightened. Every instinct screamed to flee, but she knew that running would only put Arik in greater danger. Kellen's jaw tightened as he prepared for the inevitable. Taeon's eyes flicked between the scout and the horizon, calculating, focused, ready for confrontation. Leora felt a surge of determination. She was no longer merely a woman on the edge of the prairie. She was a mother in every sense, a protector, a force intertwined with the fate of a child whose life was more than his own. And as the sun climbed high, casting the landscape in harsh light, the promise of danger pressed closer, and the tension that had been simmering for days became almost unbearable. The plains seemed to hold their breath. Every gust of wind, every whispering leaf, every distant sound became a potential threat. Leora's heart beat with anticipation, fear, and a strange exhilaration. She understood now that the story surrounding her, Arik, Kalen, and Taeon, was far from simple. It was a story of survival, of loyalty, of love, and legacy, all converging in the harsh beauty of the frontier. And as the day drew on, with shadows lengthening across the prairie, Leora knew that the coming hours would test everything she believed about courage, about family, and about the bonds that could form, even in the unlikeliest of circumstances. The conflict was no longer distant. Tit was here, pressing in from every side. The choices they would make could change the course of all their lives forever. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in sharp reds and fiery oranges, as if the plains themselves sensed the danger coming. Leora moved quietly around the cabin, her senses stretched taut. Every sound, the distant caw of a crow, the rustle of grass, the whisper of wind felt amplified, each one a potential warning. Arik lay in her arms, peaceful and unaware of the storm that approached, and she held him close, feeling the weight of the child and the responsibility that came with him. Kalen rode to the edge of the prairie, scanning the horizon where the mercenaries had been spotted. His hand rested on the hilt of his knife, and his jaw was set with grim determination. He had faced dangers before, but this was different. This was not a simple attack. It was a calculated hunt, pursuit of something he did not fully understand, yet something he knew must be stopped. Taeon emerged from the forest like a shadow made flesh, silent and commanding. His eyes were fixed on the western hills, where the wind carried scents and sounds that spoke to him in a language only he could fully understand. "They are closer," he said, his voice low but steady. "And not all of them are visible. Some move like ghosts, unseen until it is too late." Leora felt a chill run down her spine, yet beneath the fear there was a flicker of determination that refused to be snuffed out. She would not let Arik fall into danger. Not now. Not ever. The first movement came from the ridge of flash of shadow, a glint of metal. Leora instinctively pulled Arik closer, her heart hammering in her chest. Lan spurred his horse forward, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of the figures moving with deadly precision. Taeon followed silently, moving like a predator through the high grass, every step measured, every motion purposeful. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of strangers and the subtle promise of violence. Leora felt her pulse quicken as the mercenaries began to descend the hill, their horses kicking up dust, their eyes cold and calculating. She could see the fear in Kellen's jaw and the quiet tension in Taeon's shoulders, and she realized that the moment they had been preparing for had arrived. There would be no running, no escape. The plains had become a battlefield, and the stakes were higher than any of them had imagined. The first clash came like a sudden storm. A rider broke from the group, charging with reckless speed, and Kalen met him with a force born of experience and desperation. Taeon moved with deadly grace, intercepting another attacker before he could reach the cabin. Leora, still clutching Arik, felt the rush of adrenaline surge through her veins. She could hear the clash of metal, the whinny of frightened horses, the shouts and curses of men caught in a struggle they could not fully control. Amid the chaos, Taeon's voice cut through the din, commanding and fierce. "Protect the child," he shouted. Leora's hands trembled, but she felt a surge of courage she had never known. She ducked into the shadows of the cabin, moving with Arik pressed to her chest, listening to the sounds of combat around her. Every second was charged with uncertainty. Every movement could be the difference between life and death. Kalen fought like a man possessed, his blades striking with precision, his mind focused on a single goal, to keep the child safe. Yet even he could see the relentless advance of the mercenaries, a force determined to claim what they did not understand. Taeon moved between them like a guardian spirit. His arrows and movements precise, every motion reflecting a lifetime of skill and honor. And through it all, Leora felt a growing connection, a thread binding them together, not just in survival, but in something deeper, more enduring. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that twisted across the prairie. Leora caught a glimpse of Taeon as he fought, the fire of determination in his eyes, and for a moment, she saw the man behind the warrior. She realized then that her heart had claimed him in ways she had not yet admitted even to herself. The fear and urgency of the moment made the bond undeniable, a connection born of trust, protection, and an unspoken promise. A sudden shout tore through the air, and Leora's stomach dropped. One of the attackers had broken through, moving straight toward the cabin. Kalan turned, recognizing the threat, and raced to intercept. But the man was fast, ruthless. Taeon moved with him, a blur of motion and deadly precision. Leora clutched Arik tighter, her eyes flicking to the open plains beyond, knowing that the outcome of this struggle would shape their lives forever. The child stirred in her arms, sensing the tension, and she whispered his name softly, a calming thread in the storm. "Arik, stay close, stay safe," she murmured. The sound of her voice seemed to anchor her, giving her strength to stand firm even as the world around her erupted in chaos. Hours passed like minutes, each second charged with intensity. The attackers pressed again and again, testing every defense, every skill, every ounce of courage the trio could muster. Leora watched Taeon, his body moving with lethal grace, his eyes never leaving the horizon, his loyalty and strength undeniable. She felt a surge of admiration and something warmer, deeper, a pulse of emotion that made her heart ache with longing. Kalen fought fiercely, but there was a moment when even he faltered, a second of vulnerability that could have cost them everything. Leora's hands clenched around Arik, a silent prayer on her lips. And in that instant, Tyon was there, a protective shadow, intercepting danger with skill and resolve that left no room for error. The rhythm of survival, danger, and instinct bound them together, weaving a story of courage, trust, and the fragile beginnings of something more. As the sun slipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and deep indigos, the attackers paused, regrouping, assessing the strength of the defenders. Leora felt the tension coil inside her like a spring ready to snap. Every instinct told her that the final confrontation was near, that the coming night would test their courage, their bonds, and their hearts. She could hear the faint rustle of the plains, the whisper of wind through the grass, and she knew the moment of reckoning was almost upon them. Tyon emerged from the edge of the forest, his eyes meeting hers, a silent promise passing between them. There was trust, there was understanding, and beneath it all, a stirring of something tender, something unspoken. Leora's heart beat faster. She understood, in that charged moment, that whatever came next, they would face it together. The child, the warrior, the settler, and Shia's small family forged in fire, in danger, and in the quiet beginnings of love. The wind shifted again, carrying with it distant hoofbeats, the echo of voices that had grown closer. Leora's hands tightened on Arik, and she felt the pulse of the plains beneath her feet. The rhythm of a story about to reach its most dangerous chapter. Tyon's gaze never left the horizon, his stance ready, protective, commanding. Kellen's expression was set in grim determination, every muscle coiled like a spring. The night had grown heavy, full of suspense, full of possibility, full of fear and hope intertwined. Leora could feel the electricity in the air, the tension stretching tighter with every passing second. Somewhere beyond the hills, shadows moved closer. Outcome was uncertain, the danger immediate, and the story had reached the edge of its most intense moment. And in that charged silence, Leora realized the truth she had been feeling all along. The child in her arms, the warrior at her side, the man who had risked everything to keep them safe, were not just part of her story. They were part of her heart. And whatever came next, the plains, the danger, and the love that had quietly bloomed among them, would change all their lives forever. The stars began to emerge, tiny points of light over the endless prairie, and the wind whispered like a warning, like a promise. Leora held Arik close, feeling the warmth of the child and the strength of those who stood beside her. The night was alive with tension, alive with possibility, and the climax of their struggle was only moments away. Somewhere beyond the hills, the shadows shifted, and the first signs of confrontation began to take shape. Leora's breath caught, her pulse raced, and she knew that the choices, courage, and love that had brought them this far would now be tested as never before. The plains were silent for a heartbeat, holding the story in suspense, waiting for the moment when danger, devotion, and destiny would collide. The first moments of dawn broke quietly over the prairie, soft light spilling across the cabin and the surrounding hills. The night's tension had passed, leaving behind the gentle hum of a world settling again, as if the land itself was exhaling. Leora held Arik close, brushing a strand of dark hair from his small forehead, and felt the warmth of life and love more vividly than ever. The child stirred, opening wide, curious eyes, and she smiled, knowing that the storm had finally passed for now. Kalen sat nearby, his hands still calloused from the struggle, but his face was lighter, more relaxed. The weight of fear that had pressed on them all had been lifted, leaving in its place relief and something deeper, a shared triumph born of courage and loyalty. He glanced at Leora, and the faintest hint of a smile crossed his lips. It's an acknowledgement of the bond that had grown among them through fire, danger, and the quiet moments in between. Tyon emerged from the forest, as silent and commanding as ever, but his eyes held a softness that had been hidden beneath the intensity of the past days. He approached slowly, hands empty, carrying only the presence that had guided, protected, and inspired. When his gaze met Leora's, there was no need for words. She understood, in that instant, the depth of connection that had grown between them, a bond forged not just in survival but in trust, respect, and the beginnings of love. The plains were calm, yet they held the memory of the night's struggle, the danger that had stalked them, and the lesson that life on the frontier demanded vigilance, courage, and unwavering commitment to those you loved. Leora realized that the child in her arms, the warrior who had called her mother, and the steadfast settler who had brought Eric to her care had all become part of her heart in ways she could not have imagined. They had formed a family, not by blood alone, but by loyalty, sacrifice, and the quiet love that had grown between them. Kalen broke the silence, his voice steady but softer than before. "We're safe now," he said, "for the moment at least. But what matters is that we stayed together, and we protected what needed protecting." Leora nodded, feeling the weight of his words, and she glanced at Taeon, who had moved to stand near the child. The warrior's expression was calm, a reflection of the inner strength that had guided them through the storm. Taeon knelt beside Arik, letting the child's tiny fingers brush against his own. "The future is in his hands," he said quietly, "but it will also be in yours, Leora. You have shown strength, courage, and a heart capable of love. You are more than a guardian, you, our family." Leora felt a warmth spread through her chest, a quiet reassurance that despite all the danger, they had found a path forward. The word mother now carried not just mystery, but a promise and a truth she could embrace. As the sun rose higher, the plains shimmered with golden light, and the gentle wind carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. Life on the frontier, harsh and unpredictable, had taught them all lessons about resilience, trust, and the value of those who stand beside you in moments of peril. Leora realized that the challenges they had faced had only strengthened the bonds between them. Kellen's steadfastness, Taeon's wisdom, and her own courage had created a foundation for a life filled with hope, love, and purpose. The town of Redstone, once quiet and wary, began to feel alive with a renewed sense of community. Neighbors who had once whispered behind curtains now offered smiles and gestures of support. Leora could sense that the story of the child and the warrior had rippled outward, touching others, reminding them of the fragile beauty of life, the importance of protection, and the strength of compassion. She felt proud, not just for herself, but for all of them, the small family who had faced the storm and emerged stronger. As afternoon settled over the prairie, Taeon approached Leora and Kalen, standing tall but relaxed. "We have survived because we trusted one another," he said. "The plains are still wild, still dangerous, but we have proven that together we can face what comes. That is what matters." Leora smiled, the first time in days that she had felt completely at peace. Arik reached up, his small hand resting on Taeon's cheek, and the warrior's lips curved into a rare, gentle smile. Kalen reached out, resting a hand on Leora's shoulder, and she felt the quiet warmth of connection between them. "We've been through more than most would face in a lifetime," he said. "But now it feels like we can breathe again, and maybe can even hope." Leora nodded, feeling the truth of his words resonate in her heart. There was hope, yes, but also love, and the promise of a life shaped by courage and devotion. The day wore on, and as evening approached, the cabin glowed with the soft light of a setting sun. Leora sat outside with Arik in her lap, watching him reach for the sky, marveling at the simple joys of life. Taeon and Kalen worked side by side to repair the fence and gather firewood. Their presence a reminder that protection and strength need not be harsh, but steady and enduring. The moment was ordinary, yet extraordinary, a quiet triumph after days of chaos and fear. Leora realized then that the story of their lives, the child she had nursed, the warrior who had called her mother, and the settler who had brought them together, was not just a tale of survival. It was a story of family, of love born in unlikely places, and of courage tested and proven. Every shadow, every threat, every danger they had faced had led to this moment of clarity and connection. As the sun finally dipped behind the distant hills, casting long golden shadows across the prairie, Leora felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The danger that had once threatened to unravel their lives had been met with courage, skill, and unwavering devotion. The bonds between them, between herself, Taeon, Kalen, and Eric, had been strengthened, and the love that had quietly grown among them had become undeniable. Taeon knelt beside her, his hand brushing lightly over hers, as they both watched Arik play in the fading light. "The plains will always hold challenges," he said softly. "But with family, with trust, and with love, we can face anything. This child has given us all a reason to stand together, to protect one another, and to cherish what is most important." Leora felt tears prick at her eyes, not of sadness, but of relief, gratitude, and the quiet joy of knowing they had survived, and that love had flourished even in the harshest of landscapes. Kalen came to stand beside them, his gaze resting on the child and then on Leora. "We've found more than safety," he said. "We found home, and maybe something more, something worth protecting every day." Leora met his eyes, feeling the unspoken acknowledgement of their shared experience. The silent promise that the trials they had faced would not diminish the love, respect, and devotion that now bound them. As twilight deepened into night, the stars appeared above the prairie, shimmering like diamonds across an endless sky. The wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and Leora knew that the plains, though wild and unpredictable, were also a place of renewal, hope, and beauty. She held Arik close, feeling his small heart beat against her chest, and realized that in protecting him, she had discovered her own strength, courage, and capacity for love. The child, the warrior, and the settler, the trio who had faced danger, uncertainty, and fear, were now a family. A family forged in fire, tested by adversity, and united by trust, courage, and the quiet magic of love. Leora smiled, whispering Arik's name, and felt a deep sense of peace settle over her heart. The plains were vast and wild, but in their little cabin at the edge of Redstone, they had carved out a place of safety, love, and hope. The story that had begun with uncertainty, danger, and unanswered questions had reached a point of fulfillment, not the end of adventure. Perhaps, but the beginning of a life built on devotion, family, and the unbreakable bonds that only those who face storms together can know. And as the wind whispered softly through the prairie grass, Leora knew that they had survived, had loved, and had grown stronger. The child in her arms, the warrior by her side, and the settler standing watch were no longer just characters in a tale. They were a family, a testament to courage, love, and the enduring spirit of the frontier. The night wrapped them in its quiet embrace, full of stars, hope, and endless possibility. And for the first time in many long days, Leora allowed herself to believe that happiness, love, and peace were not just dreams. They were theirs to hold, protect, and cherish.